right, so welcome everybody to Lecture 5, which is called, somewhat ominously, Introspection and Revelation. Sorry, I'm just having some difficulty with my screen. Yes, let me begin by recapping again. So in the last two lectures we were looking at various arguments about transparency. As I said, it's kind of misleadingly called transparency because that involves some perceptual idea, and we've been setting that aside. But nevertheless, it's clear that there are a range of arguments called transparency arguments. And we also tried to set out some answers to those arguments, concentrating on my own favourite view, which is what I call a rationalist view. And we also took the time to criticise, especially last time, a proposal by Alex Byrne, who defends a inferentialist view about introspection. Well, today I want to change direction a little bit and look at a different aspect of the literature. This is the notion of revelation from the title. Now, to get you in the mood, let's begin with a quotation from a recent book by Philip Goff. And here's what Goff says. He says, surely you know exactly what your pain is, what it is for someone to feel pained in precisely that way, just by attending to pain and thinking about it in terms of how it feels. There's nothing in any way hidden from you about the reality of how you're feeling, nor is it possible that you're not really feeling that way. And that's because the feeling is right there for you in such a way that its reality cannot be doubted. In fact, Goff says this in his book, and then he says, please don't read on until you have taken a few minutes to consider this. And he also says that he presents this for the reader's calm and careful meditation. What Goff thinks is that if you think about this passage, you'll just accept it, just if you think about experiences from your own case, that you'll know exactly what your pain is. Well, I might ask you at the end of this lecture, and perhaps the end of the next lecture in which we're going to look at Lewis, to come back to this passage and to ask whether you agree with Goff that it's as obvious as it appears. But in any case, what is this idea? What is the idea that if you're in pain, you know exactly what your pain is? Well, we're going to think about it in terms of the notion of an essence. So the basic idea for us, and I think for Goff as well, even though he doesn't use the word essence in that particular paragraph, is this, that if you're in a conscious state, then you know the essence of the state. So, for example, if you've got a pain in your foot, you know the essence of the state of having a pain in your foot. You're in a certain state, and you know the essence of that state by being in it. That's what happens when you're in pain. You know the essence of the pain. Now, it's important to bear in mind here that we can contrast knowing that or believing that something versus knowing the essence of something. So far what we've been looking at are cases effectively of knowing that. I've been interested in whether we know that I'm seeing a cat, for example, or that I believe such and such. That's the issue that arose for puzzles about transparency, for example. But as I noted briefly in Lecture 1, while you can ask questions like that, we might also be interested in asking questions about different kinds of states of knowledge. So maybe one could know by introspection not just that I'm in certain conscious states, but also what certain conscious states are, or how certain conscious states resemble each other, for example. So notice that these are cases of knowing what, or knowing how, or something of that sort, rather than just straightforwardly knowing that such and such is the case. We might know what something is. Well, the idea of revelation is a proposal along these lines. It says that we can know by introspection not just that you're in a certain state, but what the essence of that state is. I've talked here of knowing the essence, and I'll continue to talk about knowing the essence, but actually that's equivalent to knowing what the essence is. It's a bit like sort of if you know Jones's phone number, you know what Jones's phone number is. Well, likewise, if you know the essence of something, you know what the essence is. And so what Revelation's saying is that introspection puts you in a position not just to know that you're in a certain state, but what the essence of that state is. You can know the essence of the state. Now, what is this talk of essence and essential properties and so forth? Well, in the background is a sort of familiar, a reasonably familiar, I hope, picture about what an essential property is. An essential property of something is a property without which it wouldn't be the thing that it is. If you took away that property, then you wouldn't have the thing any longer. That's the notion of an essential property. And an accidental property is just the contrast. It's a property that a thing can have, but it could also lose it and remain essentially the thing that it is. So, for example, suppose humans are essentially animals. That's not all of the essential properties they have, but suppose that they are essentially animals. Then humans couldn't be the creatures that they are if you took away their animal nature. They wouldn't remain human beings at all. So that's the reason for humans being essentially animals. That humans are mostly live on Earth, that's an accidental property of animals, of humans, not an essential feature. So if that's what an essential property is, what is the essence of something? An essential property of something is a property that without which the thing wouldn't be the thing that it is. What's the essence of something? Well, the essence of something is just, for our purposes at any rate, the totality of its essential properties. So there's some totality of properties that a thing has. Take the totality of its essential properties, that's the essence for our purposes. Now, there's an enormous amount of complexity here, both in the sort of logic and metaphysics of essential properties and essences and so forth. But I think that for our purposes we can set that aside. We don't need to worry too much about precisely how to characterize the essence or the essential property of a thing. But it will be important to notice that an essence is just the totality of a thing's essential properties. One thing, though, I should also notice is that what we're going to be talking about is the essential features of certain kinds of psychological states. So the idea is, in the case of revelation, that we can be in certain psychological states. For example, you can be in the state of feeling pain, and we can talk about the essential properties of that state, and therefore about the essence of that state. That means the totality of the essential properties of that state. The reason I mention this is because often when you think about the essential properties of something, what you have in mind is not so much the essential properties of things like states, but the essential properties of individuals. So you might ask whether some individual, like Socrates, whether he's essentially snub-nosed, to use a famous example, or not. And that's a property of Socrates, an individual. Likewise, in Kripke's example of the lectern, you might ask, is the lectern, the wooden thing that you lean on when you give a lecture, is that essentially made of the wood that it is made of, or not? Okay. But here what we're talking about are the essential properties of psychological states. Psychological states aren't like individuals in many cases. For one thing, psychological states are things that two different people can be in, or perhaps nobody can be in a certain psychological state. Psychological states behave very much like properties rather than like individuals, but nevertheless we can speak, at least I'm going to assume, that we can speak of the essential properties of these states. Okay, well, we've said that, according to Revelation, if you're in pain, then you know the essence of the pain, and we've said something about what it is to speak of the essence of something. But let's see if we can formulate Revelation a bit more clearly than that. Well, suppose that we have some property f, let's say, which is the essence of some conscious state C. It doesn't matter for these schematic purposes what f is exactly. Suppose f is the essence of some conscious state. Well, what does revelation say? How can we formulate it? Well, here's a first pass formulation. You might think, well, what revelation says is that necessarily, if you're in C, if you're in the conscious state, then you know something, that f is the essence of C. You know that f is the essence of C. But that isn't a very plausible principle. And one reason for that is that notice that to know that f is the essence of C would require you intuitively to have the concept of an essence, or to understand what an essence is. You can't know that f is the essence of C unless you have the concept of an essence. But it seems pretty plain that somebody can be in a conscious state and not even have the concept of an essence, and so therefore could not know that f is the essence of C. In fact, Quine, the famous 20th century philosopher, claimed not to understand the notion of an essence and thought of it as a kind of philosophical muddle. So he presumably didn't have the concept of an essence. In fact, he was proud, you might say, that he didn't have the concept of an essence. But I assume that Quine, just as much as anybody else, could have been in conscious states. But that is just an example of somebody who was in a conscious state but didn't know that f is the essence of C. Well, that doesn't seem to capture the idea, but perhaps we can change it slightly. So let's look at this second pass formulation of revelation. On this view, the thesis is, well, necessarily, if you're in a conscious state, you know that C is f, where, again, we're assuming in the background that f is the essence of C. So f is in fact the essence of C, and if you're in the conscious state, you know that C is f. That's often actually the way that people seem to put revelation. The idea is that if you're in the state, then you know that the state has some essence. What essence? Well, f in this case. But there's another objection to this one, and in fact this objection could also be made to the first pass proposal, and that is that it should be plain that you can be in a conscious state and not be able to believe or understand the claim that the conscious state has some essence. For one thing, you might know you might not have the concept of f. Setting aside the concept of essence, you might not even have the concept of f. You might not know what it is to be an f. And in fact, you might not even have the concept of a conscious state. But you require all of those things to know that C is f, to know that the conscious state is f, where f is its essence, whatever the essence is. You'd need to have the concepts of these things in order to know that C is f. But it seems plain that you can be in conscious states and not know that. And again, this has got very little to do with what exactly f is, or even what exactly a conscious state is. In general, consciousness seems to be something that creatures can be in. They can be in conscious states, even when they're not particularly psychologically sophisticated. And one way of being psychologically sophisticated is to have the concept of consciousness, or have the concept of f, where f is the essence of consciousness. But it seems plain that you can be in conscious states and not have those concepts, which means that this second pass formulation of revelation can't be true either. Well, let's think about the third pass. The third pass might say, well, necessarily, if you're in C, then you know that C is f, where again f is the essence of C, provided you're psychologically capable of forming the belief that C is f. So provided, what do I mean by being psychologically capable? Well, one thing I mean is that you have the relevant concepts, that you understand what the conscious state is, and you know what f is. And we can also assume, just for these purposes, that other things too are involved in being psychologically capable. For example, you're not massively distracted by something else to such a degree that you couldn't form the belief, for example. So let's suppose that none of that is true, and you're the kind of being who's psychologically capable. You're psychologically capable of forming the belief that C is f. So therefore, you're not like Quine, who who perhaps doesn't have the concept of an essence, or you're not like an animal who doesn't have the concept of F or C. You're the kind of subject who is capable of forming this belief. And so what the third pass says is that, well, if you're in a conscious state, then you'll know that C is F, so long as you're psychologically capable of forming that belief. But I think there's another objection to this third pass too, but it may be less obvious. And the objection has to do with rationality. When I talked about rationality earlier, we said, well, rationality is a matter of having your mind organized in the right way. Rational requirements are requirements about how the mind of a rational agent should be organized. What combinations of mental states are permitted or required by rationality. But if you're not rational, then there are very few constraints on how your mind ought to be organized. And in particular, if you're not rational, then you can believe or fail to believe more or less anything in more or less any circumstance. So that if you're in C, for example, if you're in a conscious state, you may fail to believe that the conscious state is F, not because you're not psychologically capable of forming that belief, but just because you're not rational. You don't form the belief just because you're not rational. So I think we have to assume that our subject here must be rational, in addition to having the capacity or the psychological capabilities of forming the relevant belief. So this gives us what I'll take to be our final pass at formulating revelation. Namely, necessarily, if you're in C, where C is some conscious state, then you'll know that C is F, where F is the essence of the state, provided you meet the psychological conditions required to form the belief that C is F, and provided also that you're rational. So that's what revelation will be for us. So we're going to come back and look at lots of different aspects of that thesis. Now, the initial thing that we might ask about revelation, so understood, is how it compares with other ideas that we may already have looked at. And in particular, we might compare revelation to what we can call self-intimation. So as I've just said, revelation is the idea that necessarily, if you're in C, where C is some conscious state, then you know that C is F, where F is the essence of the state, provided you meet the psychological conditions required to form the belief, and provided that you're rational. Well, contrast that with this other thing called self-intimation, where self-intimation might be the thesis that necessarily, if you're in C, you know that you are in C, provided you meet the psychological conditions and provided that you're rational. So the difference is that in Revelation says that you must, the difference is in what you know. Revelation says that you must know that C is F, where F is the essence. And self-intimation just says that you must know that you are in C. An important difference between these two things that you know is that in the self-intimation case, the thing that you know, that you're in C, is a contingent fact. It's a contingent fact, if it's a fact, that you're in the conscious state. You might fail to be in the conscious state, for example. Whereas it's presumably not a contingent fact that the conscious state has the essence that it does, that the conscious state is F, where F is its essence. So the things that one allegedly knows in revelation and the thing that you allegedly know in self-intimation are really quite different, even though they're sometimes assimilated. Now, self-intimation, this thesis here, necessarily, if you're in C, you know that you're in C, provided you meet the conditions and provided you're rational. That is very close to an idea that we've already looked at, which, following Shoemaker, we called the impossibility of self-blindness. Shoemaker, remember, says that it's impossible to be self-blind with respect to a conscious state, and that certain theories, for example, Armstrong's broad perceptual theory, permits that possibility, and that's the problem for them. That's pretty much Shoemaker's objection to those theories. And if to say that self-blindness is impossible is very close to saying that self-intimation is true. It's not precisely the same, and the reason is that when we were talking about the impossibility of self-blindness before, we were just talking about belief. The idea was that it would be impossible for a person who was in a conscious state, met these background conditions, to fail to believe that they were in this state. That's what the impossibility of self-blindness says is. Self-intimation says it would be impossible to be in the conscious state, to meet the background conditions, and fail to know that you're in the state. So the difference between self-intimation as formulated here and the notion of self-blindness that we talked about previously has to do with the fact that self-blindness involved belief rather than knowledge. Nevertheless, this is a very small difference because we can assume, and in fact I was assuming before, that that mostly when you form beliefs in this situation, they do amount to knowledge. So it comes to the very same kind of idea, really. So they're put in slightly different ways. The impossibility of self-blindness is obviously an impossibility claim, whereas self-intimation is a claim about what's necessarily true. But they're equivalent to each other as long as we adjust for belief and knowledge. Now, when discussing Shoemaker's arguments before, and Shoemaker's in particular Shoemaker's self-blindness argument, I was well disposed to that argument. I thought it was a persuasive argument. In that sense, I would accept that with Shoemaker that self-blindness is an impossibility. And if what I've just said about the relation between the impossibility of self-blindness and self-intimation is true, then we would accept self-intimation as well. So we'd accept that necessarily if I'm in a conscious state, then I'll know that I'm in it so long as I meet these background conditions. But even if I accept self-intimation, it doesn't follow that you should accept, that I or anyone, should accept revelation, because as we've seen, revelation is a rather different thesis. It has to do with knowing something, not knowing that you're in the state, but knowing what the essence of the state is. So the question is, should we accept revelation? Well, I'm actually going to be interested in today's lecture in 4 questions about revelation. The first question is the obvious one, namely, is it true? Is revelation true? The second question has to do with whether revelation is inconsistent with physicalism. I said right at the beginning that what I'm going to be interested in is the epistemology of consciousness, the way in which our knowledge by introspection of conscious states is different from other kinds of knowledge. And I said, well, I'm going to set aside this other big question about consciousness, namely whether it's consistent with physicalism or not, the kind of the mind-body problem, the metaphysical questions about consciousness, and we were going to set those aside. When we turn to revelation, however, the issue about the epistemology of consciousness abuts closely these issues about the mind-body issue and about the truth or falsity of physicalism. And so that begins to emerge in question 2, because there's an issue about whether revelation is inconsistent or not with physicalism. That's the second question I'm going to look at. The third and fourth questions continue this theme. The third question asks whether revelation is presupposed in philosophical thought about the mind-body problem. And as we'll see, the issue there is really whether it's presupposed in conceivability arguments against physicalism. Which can be true, incidentally, whether or not revelation is true. And then finally, there's the issue of whether revelation is presupposed in ordinary thought about the mind-body problem. Here, revelation is connected to what Chalmers has recently called the meta-problem, the problem of explaining why we find the intuitions in the mind-body problem so compelling. So, revelation is a thesis in the philosophy of introspection, but you can see that a lot of what makes that thesis interesting is that it connects up with these issues in the mind-body sort of literature. Okay, so let me turn to the first question: is revelation true? Well, I'm going to give what I think is a straightforward argument that revelation can't be true in the form that we've been looking at it. And here's the way that the argument goes. Well, so first let's consider what is sometimes called the sense-datum theory. The sense-datum theory is a well-known theory in the philosophy of perception. It was very prominent in the first half of the 20th century. One of the proponents of the sense-datum theory was G.E. Moore of diaphanousness fame. And according to that theory, when you, for example, have a pain in your foot, what is going on when you have a pain in your foot is that you bear a certain relation, which the sense-datum theory called acquaintance, to a mental individual, a particular a thing, a mental individual of a particular type. So in a sense, it's logically like having a marble in your pocket. When you have a marble in your pocket, you bear a certain relation to a physical individual of a given type. And on the sense-datum theory, when you have a pain in your foot, you bear a relation of acquaintance to a mental individual of a given type. You might bear acquaintance relations to other things too, for example, the properties of that individual. But let's just focus on this idea of being related to an individual. One might think of the individual as a pain, the pain that you have in your foot, but that one needn't describe the situation that way on the sense-datum theory. Now, along with many other philosophers, I think that the sense-datum theory isn't true. I think that there aren't such mental individuals that we bear any relationship to when we're in pain. But suppose, contrary to fact, that it is true, that it is the case that when you're in pain, you bear a relation of acquaintance to a mental individual. Then I think it would be true to say that part of the essence of having a pain, and perhaps the full essence, but certainly part of the essence, would be to that you bear a relation of acquaintance to a mental individual. So that when I'm in pain, it's essential to it that I'm involved in a relation to a mental individual. That's what the sense-datum theory says. Well, suppose now that I do have a pain in my foot. Suppose that I have a pain in my foot. And suppose also I meet the other conditions mentioned in Revelation. So I'm rational, for example, and I'm psychologically capable of forming the belief that my pain consists in this relation to a mental individual. So suppose in particular that I have the concepts involved in spelling out the sense-datum theory. All of this is possible. Well, now here's the point that I want you to focus on. If revelation were true, it would be true that I thereby know, I know as a consequence of all of these things, that I bear a relation of acquaintance to a mental particular of a given type. I would know this fact about, I know this fact about the pain that I'm in, that it consists in a relation of acquaintance to this mental individual. But it seems to me that this isn't true intuitively. In the circumstances I just asked you to imagine, I may believe that, but I may not. I may regard it as an open question. In fact, that would seem to me to be a very rational thing to do. That is, I'm in pain, I'm rational. It's true that the pain consists in a relation of acquaintance that I bear to a mental individual, but it doesn't follow that I must know that in the circumstance. It may still be an open question for me whether the sense-datum theory is true. And I think this can be brought out particularly clearly if we imagine not only that I understand the sense-datum theory, but I also understand some rival theory. So, back in the day, the big rival theory for the sense-datum theory, the big rival theory to that view, was the adverbial theory. On the adverbial theory, the idea is that you didn't bear a relation to an individual when you had a pain in your foot. You merely you merely sensed in a certain way. You sensed in the pain in the foot way, according to the adverbial theory. And it actually doesn't matter that we're thinking about an adverbial theory. These days, many people are so-called intentionalists about pain. They're intentionalists, and that means that they think that when you're in pain, you represent your foot, in this case, as being in a certain condition. So suppose I understand these theories. And now suppose that I'm in pain. I'm rational. But again, assume that the sense-datum theory is true. Assume that it gives us a true account of what pain consists in. In that case, I would have to bear a relation. If I'm in pain, then I must bear a relation of acquaintance to a mental individual. But in the circumstances, it seems to me that it would be an open question still whether the sense-datum theory is true, or whether some rival, for example, the adverbial theory, is true or not. I wouldn't have decided conclusively in favour of the sense-datum theory simply because I'm in pain and those background conditions are met. I think we can bring the basic problem for revelation here out as follows. When you think about a theory like the sense-datum theory about pain, and the rival theories like the adverbial theory or the representational theory or the intentionalist theory, when you think about those theories, you'd think, well, maybe they're true, maybe they're not, and so forth, but whether they're true or not, it seems to require evidence or argument to establish that they're true. We would need to have some arguments or evidence to show that the sense-datum theory is true. But if revelation is true, then you can know that the sense-datum theory is true, at least it can be true in this particular case, without having evidence or argument. In fact, if we go back to the contrast between revelation and self-intimation, we can bring that out. When we were talking about the Dretske argument, I said, well, it's plausible that we can come to know that you're in a conscious state without having evidence in a particular sense, as long as you're rational in a certain kind of way, and that you're in the state. Then you may have a certain kind of capacity to believe that you're in the state, and that belief, if you formed it, would amount to knowledge. And that would be a case of knowledge without evidence. Now, in the case of the proposition that's involved in self-intimation, that you're in the state, that seems to me to be a defensible view. But in the case of the proposition that the state has some sort of essence, for example, it has an essence as described by the sense-datum theory, the idea that you can come to know this without evidence doesn't seem to be plausible at all. You'd need considerable evidence to establish this. And the problem for revelation is precisely that it tells you that you can do it without evidence. You can do it just by being in the state and being rational in a certain kind of way. So that's a sort of counterexample to revelation, that it could be the case that if the sense-datum theory is true, what revelation entails is that we would know it just by being in pain. But since it seems clear that we wouldn't know it just by being in pain, revelation can't be true. Now, I think we can formulate this objection to revelation in the form of a two-premise argument and a conclusion. The first premise just draws a consequence from revelation. It says, if revelation is true, then it's impossible that you're in the conscious state, you're rational, you're psychologically capable of forming the belief that C is F, and yet you do not know that C is F, where F is the essence of C. And that just follows immediately from the definition of revelation. So suppose, for example, that F is the property of involving or being acquainted with a mental individual, and C is the property of being in pain. So what revelation says is that it's impossible that if you're in pain and you're rational and you're psychologically capable of forming the belief that being in pain is a matter of being acquainted with a mental individual, it would be impossible for that to be the case and you not to know that being in pain is a matter of being acquainted with that mental individual. That's what revelation entails. But then premise 2 says it's not impossible that that's the case. In other words, it is possible that that's the case. It is possible for you to be in pain, to be rational, to be psychologically capable of forming this belief, and yet you don't know, perhaps because you regard it as an open question. You're looking around for some evidence for whether the sense-datum theory is true. And then we can conclude from these two premises that revelation is false. The argument is straightforward in structure. It says, if revelation is true, then something is impossible. That's the first premise. Second premise says that thing is not impossible, and so we can conclude that revelation is false. Now, I've been arguing that revelation is false, but I think that we can bolster that argument by asking how we might explain revelation on the assumption, at least on the provisional assumption, that it's true. Well, as I've been formulating it, revelation is a necessarily true conditional. It says, necessarily, if you're in a conscious state, then you know something, that the conscious state is F, provided certain conditions are met. And that's actually equivalent to a conditional of the form, if you're in the conscious state and those conditions are met, then you'll know this thing. You'll know that the conscious state is F, and that conditional is necessarily true. Now, when you're confronted with a conditional that is allegedly necessarily true, even if you're not particularly hostile to that conditional, you might ask, well, what would explain the necessary truth of that conditional? Why are these things necessarily connected in the way that the claim that you're considering alleges that they are? Well, in the case of revelation, I think there are really two main possibilities here. There may be some other possibilities, but I'll set them aside. I think there are really two ways that you might try to explain why revelation, as we've been understanding it, could be true. The first way focuses on concept possession. And here what I have in mind is this: if we look back at revelation, it says, provided you meet the psychological conditions required to form the belief that C is F. Well, among the psychological conditions, as I've been saying, is that you have the concepts involved. That is, you possess the concepts of C and the concept of F, and you're able to put these concepts together to form the belief. Well, suppose, for example, that having the concept of a conscious state was a matter of knowing the essence of the state. Having the concept of the conscious state was a matter of knowing its essence. Then it would be clear that revelation is true. Because if you met the psychological conditions required to form the belief that C is F, you would understand what C is. You'd have the concept of C, and that would mean, on this view, to have the essence, to know the essence. And that would give us an explanation of revelation. So that's one way in which we might explain revelation. Another way in which we might try to explain revelation is by focusing not on what it is to possess the concept of a conscious state, but on what it is to be in a conscious state. And so, in particular, you might think that to be in a conscious state involves somehow making available the essence of that state to you. But I think neither of these proposals really do provide plausible explanations of revelation. So let's look first at the revelation and at the concept possession proposal. Remember, this would only explain revelation if we thought that revelation was somehow itself built into concept possession, or at least something closely related to revelation, the notion that having the concept of a pain was enough to know its essence. But I don't think it's plausible that having the concept of a pain means that you know its essence. And I think we can use variations of the example that we've been looking at to establish that. So suppose I'm in pain, and suppose I have the concept of a pain. So I have the relevant concepts to form the belief. It still seems to me that it would be an open question, if merely that were true, it would still be an open question whether the sense-datum theory is true. And that isn't altered even if the sense-datum theory is true. So if the sense-datum theory is true, and I'm in pain and I have the concept of having a pain, I still don't know the essence of being in pain, because I still may not know whether the sense-datum theory is true. And what that shows is that you can have the concept of pain without knowledge of its essence. We might make a slightly similar point by thinking of historical examples of philosophers who believed the sense-datum theory. So take G.E. Moore of diaphanousness fame, who I mentioned before. Moore was a person who believed, at least at certain points in his career, the sense-datum theory. Now, I assume that Moore was occasionally in pain and had the concept of having a pain just as much as anybody else. Well, did he know the essence of being in pain? Well, I've been assuming up to this point that we're imagining a counterfactual situation in which the sense-datum theory is true. But let's suppose that we focus now on the actual situation. I think in the actual situation, the sense-datum theory is false, and there must be some other theory, some rival theory, that tells us what the truth is about the essence of pain. Well, G.E. Moore didn't know this rival theory. That's because he held the sense-datum theory, and moreover, he was an incredibly rational person, so it's very unlikely that he held two inconsistent theories at the same time. So I don't think it's plausible that he held the true theory of the essence of pain, whatever that true theory is. But on the other hand, it seems as plausible as anything that he had the concept of pain and moreover was in pain at certain points. So that means again that it doesn't seem to be true that that if you have the concept of pain, you must know the essence of pain. Well, what about the idea that we can somehow build revelation into consciousness itself? Well, I think the best option here for a friend of revelation, remember the issue that we're looking at is how would we possibly explain revelation even if we provisionally agree that it's true? I think the best option here is to look at the acquaintance theory, as I called it before. And on that view, what I mean by that is the acquaintance theory about consciousness, not the sense-datum theory that I've been looking at so far. On the acquaintance theory about consciousness, what it says is that you're in a conscious state just in case, if and only if, you're acquainted with being in the state. And if you develop that view in a particular way, you might be able to offer an explanation of revelation as follows. The development I have in mind goes like this. It says, being acquainted with the state, with the conscious state you're in, gives you propositional justification for a certain belief, namely that the conscious state is F, where F is the essence of the state. What do I mean by that? Well, you'll remember when we were talking about the acquaintance view in previous lectures, I said, well, according to that view, if you're in a conscious state and you're acquainted with it, then you have propositional justification for the belief that you're in the state. Propositional justification means, in effect, that you are in a kind of epistemic position to form the belief that you're in the state. If you form the belief, that belief would be justified. It doesn't mean that you must have formed the belief, just that you're in a position to do so. Well, here what we're interested in is a slightly different idea, namely that you are in a position to form the belief not that you're in the state, but that the state has a certain essence. That C is F, where F is the essence. And that would be a development of the acquaintance view. And if you held that view, then you might think, well, this could explain revelation. And the reason is that if you're in the conscious state, then immediately, by being acquainted with it, you'd have a certain kind of propositional justification to believe that the state has a certain essence. And then if all the psychological conditions are met and you're rational, you'll believe and know that it has that essence. And so that's why, on this view, you would have a kind of explanation for revelation. Now, I should note here, I mentioned this just a minute ago, but let me note again that the notion of acquaintance here is similar, but it's not quite the same as the one invoked in the sense-datum theory. The crucial point about the sense-datum theory is that you're acquainted with a particular individual, a thing that is a pain, which is also a mental individual. But on this sort of view, you're acquainted with a state that you're in, not with an individual. Okay, so what might we say about this potential explanation of revelation, an explanation appealing to acquaintance? Well, I think this development of the acquaintance theory is highly problematic in various ways. In the first place, not all proponents of the acquaintance theory say this. I think that somebody like Philip Goff, who goes in for the acquaintance theory too, would say something along the lines I've just said. But others, for example, Brie Gertler, doesn't say that. I put a paper by Brie Gertler on the reading list, and at one point in her defense of the acquaintance view in that paper, she points out that it's not committed, as she says, to the claim that acquaintance with an object suffices for knowing it perfectly and completely. The phrase perfectly and completely comes from Russell, and that would certainly involve knowing the essence of the thing that you're acquainted with. So here what Gertler is saying is that on the acquaintance view, it's not true that you are in a position to know the essence of the state that you're acquainted with. And that sets up a kind of an awkward issue, because we've got various different versions of the acquaintance theory. Some say that you know something about the essence of the state, or you're in a position to know it if you're acquainted with it. Others don't. It's almost impossible to see how to adjudicate that issue. The second point, though, is I think much more important about this development of the acquaintance theory, and that is that it entails that just ordinary conscious creatures who are in conscious states, are in really remarkable epistemic positions. So I've been emphasizing throughout that you can be in a conscious state, you can feel pain and so forth, regardless of other sort of cognitive or rational capacities that you have. On this particular development of the acquaintance view, you can be in a conscious state, and you could be in a position to believe, you'd have propositional justification for the belief that the conscious state has a certain essence, regardless of whether you have any capacity to form that belief that the state has that essence. So, my cat Django, if he has his tail caught in the door, for example, he feels pain. According to this view, he is propositionally justified in believing not just that he's in pain, but what the essence of his pain is. That seems to me remarkable to say that ordinary creatures are in a state of that kind. And finally, it remains intuitive that revelation, as we've been interpreting it, is false. So remember, if we go back, Revelation says, necessarily, if you're in a conscious state C, you know that C is F, provided you meet the background psychological conditions and provided that you're rational. Our objection to that so far is, well, what about if F is being acquainted with a particular individual? In other words, having a property that's defined by the sense-datum theory. It doesn't seem to be true that the mere fact that you're in a conscious state would put you in a position to know that the sense-datum theory is true just because you understand the sense-datum theory and you're rational. But on this view about acquaintance, this actually would be the case, because to be in a conscious state would give you propositional justification for the belief that C is F, where F is being acquainted with the sense-datum theory. And then if you met the psychological conditions and you're rational, you would come to know that. But that doesn't seem to be a plausible claim, and that means that this acquaintance view doesn't seem to be a plausible claim either. Okay, so let me summarize where we are. I've been looking at the question, is revelation true? And I've been suggesting in different ways that it's not. The main point really is that you need evidence or argument for claims about the essence of things, even consciousness. But if revelation were true, we could come to know about the essence of these things without evidence or argument. I was also looking at how we might explain revelation were it true, and suggested that there isn't really any plausible way to do that. So that means that I think we should have a negative view about the question of whether revelation is true. Well, let's now turn to question 2, namely, is revelation inconsistent with physicalism? Well, physicalism can obviously be understood in several ways, but here I'm going to focus just on the identity version of physicalism. And on this version, there would have to be some physical property F, which is such that F is, or at least a part of, the essence of C. And that's because on an identity version of physicalism, basically the idea is that every property that's instantiated is identical with some physical property. Now this is, on the face of it, clearly inconsistent with Revelation, and Goff puts this nicely. He says, we know what pain is through feeling pain, that's the Revelation part, and hence if pain were C fibers firing, we'd know about it, but we don't, so it isn't. That's the reason that physicalism is inconsistent with Revelation. We can actually put this point again in the form of a two-premise argument that issues not in the falsity of Revelation. That doesn't just show us that Revelation is false, but it shows us that the conjunction of Revelation and physicalism is false. In other words, that they're inconsistent. And we can put it this way. Premise one, if Revelation and physicalism are both true, then it's impossible that you're in C, you're rational, you're psychologically capable of forming the belief that C is F, and yet you don't know that C is F. That would be impossible if Revelation and physicalism are both true. Here we can think of F as the physical essence of C. Suppose F is consisting in C fibers firing. So the idea is that if Revelation and physicalism were both true, it would be impossible that you're in pain, you're rational, you're psychologically capable of forming the belief that being in pain is having C fibers firing, and yet you don't know that being in pain is having C fibers firing. That would be impossible. But premise two is that that is possible. It's not impossible that you're in pain, you're rational, you're psychologically capable of forming the belief that being in pain is such and such, and yet you don't know that such and such. So from this we can get that the conjunction of Revelation and physicalism is false. Now notice that the argument here is very similar to the argument that Revelation is false. It just is in fact very like that argument. All it does is it treats F as the physical essence rather than any other kind of essence of the state that we're talking about. Okay, so I think it's true, just as Goff says, and others have said as well, that Revelation and physicalism are inconsistent. But should we conclude that physicalism is false? No, I don't think we should conclude that physicalism is false, and that's because we know that Revelation is false independently of this. We've already shown that Revelation is false. Revelation has this consequence that we would know that the sense-datum theory is true just by being in pain and being rational and having and understanding the relevant concepts. But that doesn't seem to be plausible. Another way to put this is that if you think that there's an argument called the Revelation argument against physicalism, which proceeds by establishing that Revelation and physicalism are inconsistent and then concludes that physicalism is false, you have to agree that that argument works not just against physicalism, but against any sort of non-trivial claim about the essence of the conscious state C that we've been talking about. We could construct an analogous argument against any kind of non-trivial claim about C. Or again, we could say, well, it works against physicalism, but it also works against the sense-datum theory. And perhaps it works against the adverbial theory. And perhaps it works against the representational theory too. So that isn't to say that any of these theories are true. It just means that we shouldn't use this argument to establish the falsity of physicalism, because doing so would establish the falsity of all of these other theories as well. Okay, so I've argued so far that Revelation isn't true, and we've also agreed that it's inconsistent with physicalism, but I've suggested that the significance of that last point, the idea that Revelation is inconsistent with physicalism, is somewhat diminished, and that's because while it's inconsistent with physicalism, it's pretty much inconsistent with any non-trivial claim about the essence. What do I mean by a non-trivial claim? I mean Well, one might say, being in pain is just being in pain. Revelation may not be inconsistent with that, but any kind of more interesting claim, like being in pain is being acquainted with a sense-datum, or being in pain is to sense in the pain way, or being in pain is to represent something in your foot, all of these things are in the target range of an argument that takes revelation as a premise. But at this point, I think we need to consider a complication which looks as if it might undermine what I've been saying. And that has to do with the distinction between partial and full revelation. So let me turn to that. Well, okay, let's look again at revelation. So revelation is necessarily, if you're in a conscious state C, you know that C is F, provided you meet the psychological conditions required to form the belief that C is F, and provided also that you're rational. F again is just the essence of, it's just the dummy for the essence of C. It's just the essence of C, whatever that happens to be. Now, when I was talking about what the essence of C was, I said, well, the essence of something is the totality of its essential properties. So that means that F here in the formulation of revelation is supposed to be the totality of the essential properties of this conscious state. But that suggests that we could imagine a variation on revelation. We could imagine not that F is the totality of the essential properties, but just that it's one essential property, for example, of C. Or perhaps it's one part of the totality, not exactly just one on its own, but just part of the totality of the essential properties, but not the totality itself. And if we interpret revelation in this way, we have what we can call the thesis of partial revelation. Revelation, as we've been talking about up to now, is really full revelation. It's where C is the essence, where F, is the essence of C, the totality of the essential properties of C. But we can imagine a case where it's just one, let's say, essential property, and that would be a thesis of partial revelation. So to give you an illustration of partial revelation, let's suppose that, it's often said, for example, that pain is a feeling. Being in pain involves having a feeling of some sort. There are other kinds of feelings, feeling itchy, feeling anger, and so forth, but being in pain is one sort of feeling. Well, suppose that being or involving a feeling of this sort is an essential property of being in pain. In other words, it's essentially true that if you're in pain, you feel a certain way. That seems pretty plausible. Well, then we could imagine that partial revelation would now entail the following thing. It would entail that if you're in pain, then you know that being in pain has or involves a feeling, being in pain has that essential property. It has or involves a feeling, provided you meet the psychological conditions required to form the belief that being in pain has or involves a feeling, and provided also that you're rational. I'm sorry, I have the word avoidance there. That's from an earlier version of this. Just ignore that. Now, so what partial revelation says is that if you're in pain, then you'll know this essential property, given the circumstances. But notice that partial revelation is consistent with your failing to know all of the other essential features of pain. In principle, you could lack knowledge of all of the other essential properties of being in pain. So in particular, you may not know that being in pain consists of being acquainted with a sense-datum, even if it was true, or that being in pain consists of the instantiation of some physical property, even if that were true. You may not know these things as long as you know this one essential feature of being in pain. Now, so understood, partial revelation is a much more plausible thesis than full revelation. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. One might object to it, but nevertheless, it's a much more plausible thesis than full revelation. So if we think about our answers to our first two questions, in fact, the situation looks very different if partial revelation is in play rather than full revelation. So as regards question 1, for example, we can't argue that partial revelation is false in the way that we argued that full revelation is false. In the case of that, we said, well, if full revelation is true, we would come to know, for example, in the circumstances I imagined, that the sense-datum theory is true simply by being in pain and meeting these background conditions. But partial revelation doesn't have that consequence. It permits that the sense-datum theory is true, and we might not know that even in the conditions. All it says is that we'd have to know this other essential property, namely that pain consists in a certain sort of feeling. And likewise, as regards question 2, we can't use partial revelation to argue against physicalism, because partial revelation isn't inconsistent with physicalism. Partial revelation just says in this example that if you're in pain, you'll know that pain is a feeling, given the certain background conditions, but it's quite consistent with that pain consists in a physical property of some sort. Perhaps that pain consists in having C fibres firing. After all, if having C fibres firing can just be being in pain, then having C fibres firing must consist in a certain sort of feeling. Well, now you might ask, well, what's the interest of partial revelation? Revelation seems like an interesting thesis that is inconsistent with physicalism, for example, and looks as if it's false, but partial revelation doesn't have those properties. Well, the answer is that some philosophers have argued that while partial revelation is different from full revelation, one can move from partial revelation to full revelation, at least move in a certain sort of way. And the importance of this is that if partial revelation can be defended, we haven't looked that closely as to whether it can be defended, but nevertheless it does look offhand much more plausible than full revelation. But if partial revelation can be defended, then we can accept partial revelation, but move to full revelation. This argument has been made by a number of philosophers, including Eric Yamas, who's a student here at ANU. But another person who's made this argument is Philip Goff. And here's the way that Goff makes the point. He says, here's the crucial premise, here's the crucial passage, I think. He says, if a property denoting concept C is, as Goff says, translucent, then there is some aspect of its referent, that means the property denoted by C, some property of that property, call it A, that is transparently revealed to the concept user. If a property denoting concept C is translucent, then there is some aspect of its referent, call it A, that is transparently revealed to the concept user. Now there's a bunch of terminology here that's special to Goff in particular, namely the idea of translucency and transparency. But if we transpose that to our discussion, I think what Goff is saying is that if partial revelation is true of something, then full revelation will be true of a related thing. So, for example, using the case that we've been thinking about, being in pain and consisting in a certain kind of feeling, if partial revelation is true of being in pain, then full revelation would be true of being or involving a feeling. Again, partial revelation might say that if you're in pain and you're rational and you meet these background conditions, you'll know this essential property of being in pain. That's what partial revelation says. What Goff says is if that's true, then full revelation must be true of that property of having a feeling. And the importance of this is that Goff thinks that the same sorts of arguments would apply to this aspect of being in pain, even if they don't apply to pain. So to put it in summary form, the idea is that if you accept partial revelation, then you'd have to accept a version, at least, of full revelation anyway. So we can think of this, if you like, as an argument for full revelation. And this argument would be a bit curious from the point of view of our discussion so far, because the point of view of our discussion so far has been that revelation seems clearly false. But the problem, I think, is that Goff's bridge principle here is extremely implausible. Goff is saying that if partial revelation is true with respect to something, then full revelation must be true with respect to some related thing. But that in general doesn't seem to be true. And to illustrate this, let's take this sort of simple example. Suppose it's essential to humans that they're animals, for example. It's an essential property of humans that they're animals. Well, that seems fair enough. Now, suppose also that you have the concept of a human. I don't know if this is correct, but we can imagine. Suppose that you have the concept of a human only if you know that humans are animals. So to have the concept of a human to have the concept of a human entails knowing that humans are animals. Now, those assumptions show that the concept is translucent in Goff's sense, and what he means by that is it reveals some but not all of the essence of human beings. So to have the concept of a human, you must know that humans are animals, which is to know that humans have some essential property, namely that they're animals. But it's not to tell you the totality of the essential properties of humans. Being an animal is just one essential property of being a human. Now, what Goff thinks is that in this circumstance, it would follow that the concept of an animal is transparent. That is, that you would have the concept of an animal only if you know all of the essential properties of an animal. In other words, if partial revelation is true or something like partial revelation is true of a human, that you know some of the essential properties, in particular you know that humans are animals, you must know fully about the essential properties of an animal. That's the idea. So in other words, again, the concept of a human here would be translucent, and if it were translucent, then the concept of an animal would have to be transparent, that you know all of the essential properties of an animal. But that doesn't seem to be true. It doesn't seem to be true that when you have the concept of a human, even if it's the case that having the concept of a human requires you to know that humans are animals, it doesn't follow from that you know all of the essential properties of an animal. In fact, think about what would follow if you did have to know all of the essential properties of an animal. If you don't know all of the essential properties of an animal on this sort of view, then you couldn't have the concept of a human. And since most of us, I assume, don't know all of the essential properties of animals, then we couldn't possibly have the concept of a human on Goff's view. So I don't think that the bridge principle moving from partial revelation to full revelation is very plausible. Okay, so what's the story so far in our discussion? Well, our answers to the first two questions, namely, is revelation true and is revelation inconsistent with physicalism, are no and yes. And we've also distinguished full and partial revelation, and we've rejected a proposed bridge principle about their connection. Partial revelation may be a relatively plausible thesis, but it's also a relatively uninteresting thesis. Full revelation is quite interesting, but it seems false. But there's no particular way of getting from partial revelation to full revelation. Okay, so now I want to turn to the third and fourth questions of the four I distinguished above. And these questions concern not so much whether revelation is true, whether it's inconsistent with something, but whether it's presupposed in philosophical or ordinary thought. So let me first, when thinking about these questions, let me first say something about presupposition in general. In general, something can be presupposed in an argument or a question or a line of reasoning without its being true. So here's an example. Take the question, have you finished cleaning up your room yet? A question that gets asked in our house quite often. Have you finished cleaning up your room yet? Now that presupposes that the addressee here, the person addressed, namely you, is, or at least were, cleaning up your room. It presupposes that you were or are cleaning up your room. But that presupposition may be false. It may turn out that you haven't even started cleaning up your room. Okay. So you can ask a question, and it can be true that a question presupposes something, even though that presupposition is false. And that means that when we're interested in the second and third questions, in asking whether philosophical or ordinary thinking or ways of thinking presuppose revelation, we're going to be interested again in whether it presupposes revelation somewhat in the way that this question presupposes that you were or are cleaning up your room. And also we can ask that question in the absence of whether that presupposition is true. It may be true, it may not be true, but we can certainly ask this question independently. Now, as there's a sort of a comment that one should make here that's sort of analogous to the comment about essences and essential properties, and that is that there's a lot of complexity about what presuppositions are and how to understand them. We won't go into that complexity here, just an impressionistic understanding will be sufficient. Now, when thinking about question 3, which is whether revelation is presupposed in philosophical thinking about the mind-body problem, we're not really asking whether certain philosophers sometimes assume or presuppose revelation when they talk about the mind-body problem. That's clearly true. I mean, Philip Goff, for example, clearly presupposes or assumes revelation when he's talking about the mind-body problem. But that isn't really to the point. The point is more about whether certain arguments or theses that are involved in the mind-body problem presuppose revelation. And moreover, the issue isn't so much whether even the formulations of these arguments presuppose revelation. The question is whether they presuppose revelation in the sense that they wouldn't work, or the arguments wouldn't work, or the theses wouldn't be true in the absence of that presupposition, if the presupposition were false. And I think that to give this question some shape, we need to focus on a particular argument. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is look at the conceivability argument, which is the sort of central argument really in the mind-body problem, and ask whether it assumes or presupposes revelation. So first of all, what is the conceivability argument? Well, there are lots of ways of formulating this argument. Here I'm going to operate with an incredibly simple version, and the version we'll operate with goes like this. It's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in all physical respects, but who does not feel a pain in their foot. The situation we're imagining is a case in which here I am, I have a pain in my foot, but it's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in respect of everything physical about me, but who doesn't have that feeling. Second premise, if that's conceivable, if it's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in all physical respects, but who doesn't feel a pain in their foot, then it's possible. Third premise, if it's possible, then physicalism is false. Conclusion, physicalism is false. Now, this is a well-known argument, as I mentioned. There's lots of highways and byways here, lots of complexity under the surface. I won't be interested in that. I'm interested only in the question of whether revelation is presupposed in this argument. Okay, but the question is, well, where could it possibly be presupposed? It doesn't seem to be presupposed, for example, in the passage from the premises of the argument to the conclusion. The argument seems to be a valid argument, and revelation has got nothing to do with that. Nor does it have anything to do with premise 3. Premise 3, in the background of premise 3 is just a claim about physicalism. For example, if physicalism were identity physicalism, then having a pain in your foot would be identical to a physical property. And that means that nobody who is identical to me in respect of all physical properties could fail to have a pain in their foot, because I have a pain in my foot and that's identical to some physical property that I have. But this has got nothing to do with revelation. So if revelation is somehow presupposed or assumed in this argument, it must have something to do with premises 1 and 2. But I think if we look at these premises, it's very hard to see how revelation could be presupposed in either of them. So let's look at premise 1. Premise 1 says, it's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in all physical respects, but who does not feel a pain in their foot. Now this premise doesn't seem to presuppose revelation in any obvious way. For one thing, it's just a premise. It doesn't presuppose anything about what would happen if I'm in pain. what I would know if I were in pain. And it doesn't seem to, even if I were to advance this premise, it doesn't seem to connect in any way with revelation. Now, it's true that if I were to advance or believe this premise in the course of reasoning, using a piece of conceivability reasoning, it's true that I'd have to have some understanding of what it is to feel a pain in your foot. Okay, I'd have to have, if you like, the concept of pain, or the concept of a pain in my foot, or something along those lines. And that's because the asserting the premise requires you to understand the elements in the premise. You need to know what it is, for someone to be identical to me, or what physical respects are. And likewise, you need to understand what it is to feel a pain in your foot. You need to have the relevant concepts. That's certainly true. But as we've already seen, understanding something doesn't mean knowing its essence. Having the concept of a pain in the foot doesn't mean knowing the essence of having a pain in the foot. That was the lesson of our earlier discussion of the sense-datum theory. So I don't think that this premise presupposes anything about revelation. Well, let's think about the second premise. The second premise moves from conceivability to possibility. If it's conceivable that there is someone identical to me in all physical respects, but who does not feel a pain in their foot, then that is possible. Sorry, this slide has left out the connection between conceivability and possibility. But let's just imagine it back in. If it's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in all physical respects, but who does not feel a pain in their foot, then that is possible. But this premise doesn't presuppose revelation either, I don't think. Again, it presupposes some understanding of what it is to have a pain in your foot, but it doesn't seem to presuppose revelation either. And we can illustrate this in a slightly different way by noticing that this premise, the inference from conceivability to possibility here, is an instance of a very general claim, a claim that we accept in many cases where we have no apparent qualms about revelation. So there's a number of ways of illustrating this, but my own favourite way of illustrating it is by contrasting this conceivability argument with the conceivability argument against behaviourism. This is a well-known argument, sometimes called the perfect actor argument, but we can formulate it in a way that's precisely the same as the argument against physicalism. It's just that wherever you see the word physical, you substitute in behavioural. And so in particular, we have behavioural respects rather than physical respects. And instead of physicalism, we have behaviourism. So the argument goes, it's conceivable that there is someone identical to me in all behavioural respects, but who does not feel a pain in their foot. Premise 2, if it's conceivable that there is someone identical to me in all behavioural respects, but who does not feel a pain in their foot, then it's possible. If it's possible, behaviourism is false. Behaviourism is false. Why is behaviourism is false? Well, behaviourism says that anybody who's identical to me in respect of behaviour, or at least dispositions to behave, will be psychologically the same as me. So that if I have a pain in my foot, then any duplicate of me in terms of behaviour will likewise have a pain in their foot. But this argument goes against that view. Now, normally this is assumed to be a sound argument. In fact, most people who discuss the philosophy of mind will assume that this is a sound argument and a good refutation of behaviourism. But notice that premise 2 is identical to the premise 2 of this argument. Premise 2 star is identical to the second premise of the conceivability argument against physicalism, and that's because the arguments themselves are structurally the same. But that means that this particular premise in this argument would, if it really presupposed revelation, then we could reject the argument on that basis. Or at any rate, the argument would be in serious trouble, because if the conceivability argument against materialism presupposed revelation at that second premise, then this conceivability argument against behaviourism would presuppose it for the same reason. But we don't think of this argument as presupposing revelation, or at any rate we don't think that it's problematic at all. And that means that we don't think, it doesn't seem plausible to think that the conceivability argument against physicalism presupposes revelation. I think actually the same point applies for many other conceivability arguments that we might imagine. There are historically important versions of the conceivability argument against physicalism, where the notion of the physical is understood in a much more restricted way than it is in the contemporary literature. I think conceivability arguments in those versions would be sound as well, but they don't presuppose revelation, or at least they don't presuppose revelation, if by that you mean they would be in trouble if they do, because they're not in trouble. Okay, so let's summarize where we are. Question 3 was, is revelation presupposed in philosophical thought about the mind-body problem? And we've arrived at a negative answer to that question, and the way we address that question is by looking at the conceivability argument against physicalism and just asking if revelation is presupposed in that argument. Now, perhaps I've been somewhat overly literalist about this because I've just been staring at the argument and asking whether revelation is presupposed in it. But at least if you go through that procedure, it doesn't seem to presuppose it at all. There doesn't seem to be any connection to revelation in these arguments. And the way to illustrate that is to notice that the conceivability argument against materialism is structurally the same as the conceivability argument against behaviorism, which suggests that if revelation were presupposed in one, then it would be presupposed in the other, but it doesn't seem to be presupposed in the argument about behaviorism. Now, none of this, of course, this negative answer to question 3 doesn't entail for a moment that the conceivability argument is sound or unsound. We haven't broached that question at all. We've just said that it doesn't presuppose revelation. Somebody might say that it does presuppose revelation because they might think, well, revelation is false, and so if the argument presupposed revelation, we could reject it. That line of argument seems to be mistaken. Okay, so let me turn finally, in the final parts of this particular lecture, to question 4, which is revelation presupposed in ordinary thought, not philosophical thought, about the mind-body problem? Well, in the background to question 4 about ordinary thought is what Dave Chalmers has called the meta-problem of consciousness. And here's the way that Chalmers introduces the meta-problem. This is from the very first part of his well-known paper on this topic. He says, the initial problem is the hard problem of consciousness. Why and how do physical processes in the brain give rise to conscious experience? The meta-problem is the problem of explaining why we think consciousness poses a hard problem. Or in other terms, the problem of explaining why we think consciousness is hard to explain. So the basic idea of the hard problem, the basic idea of the meta-problem is that the hard problem, which in effect is the mind-body problem, at least for our purposes is the mind-body problem, is sort of something like a cultural universal, or at least is certainly culturally very widespread. That is, it's in many cultures, people have strongly felt the intuitions that lead to the mind-body problem. And so the meta-problem is what psychologically explains this fact. What kind of explanation might we give of this? That's in the background to question 4. And the reason it's connected to revelation is that a number of philosophers have either explicitly suggested or at least have said things that entail that revelation is part of the answer to the meta-problem. Revelation is the key thing that explains why the intuitions associated with the mind-body problem are so compelling to so many people. A number of philosophers have suggested this. So Michelle Yu, for example, who I've put on the reading list, though this particular part of her work is in her dissertation, not in the published work so far, she has interesting arguments to suggest that revelation is somehow built into the way we ordinarily talk about pain, for example. We talk about what pain really is. She thinks that we're really talking about revelation. Francois Camara, in his work on illusionism and on related work about the meta-problem, says that revelation, or something very like revelation, is built into the ordinary structure of the mind. That we can think about the architecture of the mind as involving revelation. Wolfgang Schwartz has suggested on sort of Bayesian grounds and perhaps on evolutionary grounds that we can expect that certain kinds of agents that have evolved in a certain kind of way will be committed to revelation, or at least will think that something like revelation is true. And finally, David Lewis has argued that revelation is somehow presupposed in folk psychology, in our ordinary ways of attributing mental states to ourselves and other people. Now, I'm going to talk about Lewis next time, but with that exception, I'm not going to go into these ideas here. These are ideas about how revelation, or at least something very like revelation, is built into ordinary thought. I'm not going to try to assess these ideas today, or indeed in this course, but let me make some cautionary remarks, which I think are prompted by what we've been saying. The first remark is that it's extremely easy, and not just for ordinary people, but also for philosophers and scientists, to confuse revelation and other theses. And in that sense, I think one should be quite skeptical about claims that revelation is part of ordinary thought. In fact, next time, as I said, I'm going to look at David Lewis's view that revelation is built into folk psychology. Lewis thinks that Kripke, in a certain crucial part of his philosophy of mind, is assuming revelation. I don't think that's right. I think Lewis has mistaken what Kripke is talking about. So that's an example of how even people like Lewis and Kripke can be mistaken about whether they're talking about revelation or something else. And that suggests that we should be, I think, be pretty skeptical about claims that revelation, that ordinary people are somehow committed to revelation. The second remark is that much of the interest of the work that I was just gesturing at, the work of Kammerer and Schwartz and Liu and so forth, much of the interest of that is driven by the idea that revelation is clearly presupposed in philosophical thought about the mind-body problem. Their idea is that revelation is involved in philosophical thought about the mind-body problem. And so the interesting question connecting it to the meta issue is whether it's presupposed in ordinary thought as well. But actually our early discussion goes strongly against this. Our earlier discussion about question 3 seemed to yield to the conclusion that revelation was much less central to philosophical thought about the mind-body problem than it's often thought to be. Revelation doesn't seem to be presupposed, for example, in the conceivability argument. And the final remark is that it seems to be possible in any case to think about solutions to the meta problem which don't involve revelation. Revelation might be a part of some solutions, potential solutions, but it doesn't need to be part of the to all potential solutions or to the truth of the situation. Well, how might we think about the meta problem without revelation? If we set revelation aside, can we think about how ordinary thought thinks about the mind-body problem? We can think about solutions to the meta problem independently of revelation. Well, one answer, of course, is suggested by the topic of the summer school, namely about introspection. You might think, well, isn't there a very big difference between the mental and the physical? Maybe the mental, or at least the conscious mental, is known by introspection. But the physical, at least the physical insofar as it's not identical to the conscious mental, is not known by introspection. It's known by perception and inference. And as we started out thinking that introspection is distinct in certain ways from perception and inference, at least as they're ordinarily understood. But I think this appealing to just this epistemological difference isn't going to help much with the meta problem. And this point is well made by Chalmers in his discussion of this. He points out that views of this kind that relies simply on an introspection, on the notion of introspection or an epistemological difference between the mental and the physical, will confront what he calls the problem of belief. And the basic idea is that, well, beliefs are introspectively available too, and we don't have strong mind-body intuitions about beliefs. And in fact, we made that point ourselves, or at least something kind of related to that point, right in the first lecture. The idea is that you don't want an approach to introspection that's somehow limited to phenomenal states, states of phenomenal consciousness having to do with, feeling pain or having other kinds of experiences. And that's because states like belief, desire, intention, and so forth are introspectable as well. And so, as it were, the realm of the introspectable and the realm of what constitutes, mind-body intuitions don't seem to be the same. That's what's involved here in this problem of belief. But I think there's a different way of thinking about the meta problem that has got nothing to do with revelation. And that sort of points out that we are what else Susan Stebbing called in a great phrase. She said that we are inveterate visualizers of the physical. Or actually, she didn't say that we are inveterate visualizers of the physical. She said that Arthur Eddington is the well-known physicist was an inveterate visualizer. This is from Stebbing. Stebbing wrote a series of criticisms of Eddington in the 30s and 40s and pointed out that he was thinking about the physical in highly visual terms. But in fact, that seems to be true of a lot of the way that we think about the physical. We do tend to think about the physical world on the model of ordinary physical objects and their perceptually available properties. We think of them as in principle objects of perception. And if that were the case, if you think about the physical world in that way, then it's not surprising that you'll confront intuitions that I think that are central to the mind-body problem, because phenomenal states seem, in a certain sense, to come apart from perceptually available properties. One data point in support of this idea is as follows. You can think, actually, while Chalmers is interested in the meta-problem of consciousness, any philosophical problem is going to have its meta-problem, because we can always ask for any philosophical question, at least if the intuitions behind that philosophical question are relatively widespread, we could ask why psychologically are they widespread and what explains this? Well, if that's the case, then we can also ask about the meta-problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is the problem and the epistemological problem of trying to figure out that other people have minds just as we do. Why, on the basis of behavioural evidence, can we be so sure that other people think and feel just as we do? Now, when you think about the meta-problem of other minds, why are we gripped by that problem? It's very natural to think that it has something to do with the kind of information that we have available to us in perception. So if I look at my cat, for example, I have certain kinds of information about the cat available to me from perception, but that information by itself doesn't seem to entail at all that the cat feels anything at all. That doesn't entail that I should be a skeptic about the mind of my cat. I'm pretty sure that my cat feels things, but it does mean that that the gap between the perceptually available information and whether the cat feels anything seems to be crucial to the meta problem of other minds. Does that story apply to the mind-body case? Well, I think it probably does apply to the mind-body case, as long as we make the further assumption that the physical, whatever it is assumed to be something that's perceptually available. But actually that is assumed in many views about the physical. It's assumed, if we're thinking with Stebbing, that we are inveterate visualizers of the physical, for example. It's also assumed in what Bertrand Russell called our imaginative picture of matter. The idea is that we tend to imagine matter as something that's perceptually available, and if that's the case, then we won't think of it as we'll think of it as quite different from sensation. Now, do these proposals confront what Chalmers calls the problem of belief? Well, they do a little bit. I mean, it is true that in the other minds case, one can ask not only whether my cat whether my cat feels something, whether my cat has certain experiences, but I can also ask whether it believes something. But I think that what is true is that the belief case is the distinction between perceptually available information and belief is different from the relation between from the relation between perceptually available information and sensation. The sensation case seems to be quite different, and I think that's because it's easier to get to belief than to sensation, and that would be part of the line of thought here. Well, needless to say, all of those last few slides are very speculative. I'm not advancing that view right now. The idea that we can solve the meta problem by appealing to our imaginative conception of matter. But I think they do at least show that we can think about the meta problem in a way that doesn't rely on revelation. And in that sense, we might think that, who knows exactly whether revelation is part of ordinary thought, but we don't need to assume that it is, at least, to solve the meta problem. And I think that fits in with our earlier discussion that revelation plays less of a role than is sometimes assumed in the philosophy of mind. It's often assumed that it plays a really crucial role in the mind-body problem, for example. Anyway, but these conclusions, I think, go against a lot of the literature on this. As I say, it's often assumed that the contrary is the case and that revelation plays a very central role. So what I'm going to do next time is look in detail at a classic paper on this literature that takes the opposite view, and that's Lewis's paper called Should a Materialist Believe in Qualia? So we will take this up then. So I'll talk to you then. Thanks very much.